There's 3 reasons that I like guns. Number 1, humans are made with inalienable rights to life and self-defense. And for the last 5 centuries or so, firearms are just the best tools for that job. And then secondly, when people have access to powerful tools like this, it actually has a civilizing effect. If that power can be distributed throughout a civilization, it's much better than when it is centralized in the hands of tyrants or bullies. And then thirdly, firearms are just cool. They're just intrinsically cool pieces of technology. There's a lot of chemical engineering and mechanical science going on in here. There's a whole bunch of cool ballistic and manufacturing stuff. But there's also 3 things that I want to talk about, which are things I don't like about how the ATF restricts firearms. Number 1, the Constitution is very clear that the government cannot infringe upon that right of self-defense that people have. The ATF kind of infringes on that right. Secondly, they kind of infringe on the separation of powers that the Constitution has put into place. The idea is that we have a legislative branch that makes laws. We have this executive branch that enforces the laws. They're not supposed to be making them on their own. Then the third reason that the ATF's restrictions on firearms and firearm ownership is really annoying is they kind of ignore 500 years of mechanical, quantifiable metrics for firearms and defining these physical objects, and just turn them into kind of fuzzy nonsense. So today we're going to be talking about a very specific lawsuit called Garland versus VanDerStok. This is an important lawsuit because it directly sues the ATF for their recent rule change. They have a new rule change that went into effect a few years ago that redefines frames and receivers, which is kind of a big deal. Not for everybody, but it's kind of a big deal because it talks about what is and isn't a gun, and it changes the way that guns have been defined for a long time. Now, first of all, I want you to remember that homemade guns in the United States are legal and always have been. You have always been allowed to make your own gun at home using whatever equipment that you have lying around, whatever raw materials you are able to machine. It's always been legal, and it's still legal. And the only real issues that you run into are when you go to sell that to somebody. Then it needs to be serialized, and it goes into the normal system of FFLs and background checks and etc. But making the gun at home is absolutely, completely fine. Until this rule change comes along and just sort of changes what is understood to be fine. Also what is understood to be a gun, and a receiver, and a frame, and a parts kit, and a jig. All of these words get changed in this new rule change. And the reason for that is that in the past, one particular part of the firearm has needed to be the serialized part. And you can sell individual firearm parts and pieces as you like because they're not technically firearms. And there's always going to be something that is halfway between a chunk of metal and a finished firearm, and that's obviously not a finished firearm yet. But something happened pretty recently in America, and that was the invention of a new term called the ghost gun. Now, this isn't a new invention when it comes to metal or when it comes to plastic or when it comes to firearms. It is simply a marketing term. Not a marketing term used by the firearm industry, but a marketing term used by the gun control industry. So, the new firearm and receiver rule handed down by the ATF exists because of ghost guns. It's too easy, they say, to make firearms at home, even though it's legal. It's too easy to buy partially finished firearm receivers and turn them into firearms. It's too easy to buy firearm parts. And so we get a new rule that makes it illegal to do certain things, but it doesn't define them very well. And that is where we get the actual lawsuit. For example, this lathe isn't used to make firearms at T-Rex Arms. In fact, neither is that Bridgeport. We don't really make firearms at T-Rex Arms, but if we started making firearms on this lathe, would it become a firearm tool? What about all the little pins and pieces of firearms that aren't guns in and of themselves? What about springs? If I had a piece of wire and I wrapped it around the right diameter rod in this lathe, I could make a spring for a firearm. Is that now a controlled part or not? When the laws are fuzzy, you have some significant issues, and that brings us to this particular lawsuit against the ATF for this rule change. So let's go over the Garland versus VanDerStok and VanDerStok versus Garland case. There's been a lot of back and forth, but it began around this time in 22. And what happened was, once the ATF filed this new rule change and they put it into effect, they changed the way that they defined frames and receivers, and partially finished frames and partially finished receivers and other firearm parts and firearm kits, so that it was really hard for a lot of companies to do business anymore. They filed a lawsuit against the ATF, and their lawsuit was found to have merit by a district judge named O'Connell. He actually told the ATF they could not enforce the new rules, and the ATF promptly appealed that. Anyway, we are now at the point where the Supreme Court is going to hear this case in October. And the reason we're talking about it this week is that last week a whole bunch of people filed amicus briefs. Some of them are the plaintiffs of the case, but there's also a whole bunch of Second Amendment organizations that are providing extra information to the court. These are going to be documents that will be reviewed by the Supreme Court justices and all the people that are involved in that process to provide some extra information and extra argumentation to the case. Now, before I go through the list of those briefs, and I want to specifically thank all the people who went to the work of drafting them and filing them, because it is not a simple, easy, or cheap thing to do. I want to make a general prediction. I believe that the Supreme Court will actually agree with the plaintiffs and with Judge O'Connell that the ATF has overstepped its bounds, that they cannot merely expand drastically the rules so that they're essentially making new law and creating new crimes and creating new penalties. I believe that they will uphold this particular ruling because earlier this year, they ruled on something called the Chevron principle, which goes into this very area of legislative power existing within Congress to make laws, and then regulatory agencies like the EPA and the IRS and others making up interpretations. Now, obviously, these regulatory groups do have to write some level of policy and procedure so that they can actually do their jobs around the law that has been passed. But when they create entirely new categories, when they completely change the interpretation, when they make it wide open, there is an issue there. And the Supreme Court has already ruled in the favor of restraining the executive branch and limiting those lawmaking powers to the legislative branch earlier this year. So my hope is that they will continue this trend. They will uphold that particular precedent when it comes to this case. And I think that what will help them come to that conclusion is the evidence which has been brought together by the plaintiffs, the original filers of the lawsuit, and then also all the folks who filed amicus briefs that I'm going to go over right now. I'm going to link down below so that you can read these as well, but first I want to call out the plaintiffs and say thank you for filing this lawsuit in the first place. This is the kind of battle for our rights that needs to be done, even though it is hard work, unpleasant, and expensive. That's VanDerStok, Tactical Machining Firearms, Blackhawk, etc., Defense Distributed, Polymer 80, and they had the help of some different firearm groups like the Second Amendment Foundation. And then we also have some briefs that have been filed by the NRA. We have had some differences with the NRA in the past as they have defined things and done some lobbying stuff, but this right here is a very solid brief, and it goes into the importance of homemade guns in American history and domestic firearm production as part of our history, part of the citizen defense industry, even though they didn't quite use that term, and the reason to not put a damper on American innovation. So, great brief from the NRA. There's also going to be the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms. They did a great job. The FRAC and Palmetto State Armory. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. A brief has been filed by a former ATF agent, a guy who worked in the technical branch named Rick Vasquez. And this is an interesting one because he describes in detail the process of taking an 80% lower for an AR-15 or for a Polymer 80 Glock Gen 3 knockoff and converting it into a functioning firearm. It's a lot of steps, and he says at the end that the ATF's assertion that these things are very easy and simple and readily convertible is wrong. They're actually misrepresenting what it takes to create a functioning homemade firearms. So kudos to him. And then we have the Foundation for Moral Law. Gun Owners of America teamed up with the Tennessee Firearms Association. Shout out to them. And the Virginia Citizens Defense League. These are three groups that have done some tremendous work over the years, and it's fun to see them collaborating on a thing. NAGR, NSSF, and the Attorney Generals for 28 different states collaborated on a brief saying that we, as the legal representatives of these states, ask that you prevent the ATF from encroaching upon the liberties of our citizens. So all in all, it is a pretty significant group of people, and it is a pretty significant group of data that has been pulled together to make this case for the case that's going to be heard in October. But I want to specifically mention PSA because A, they're one of the few groups who have filed something that don't really have a dog in the fight per se. They make firearms that aren't really associated with this. They don't really sell kits as much. They're not part of the original plaintiffs, and they're also not a Second Amendment foundation. They are a private company spending their own money on filing one of these briefs, and I think that that deserves a little bit of a special call out, as well as the call out for the plaintiffs. But also, I really like their point because their brief goes into a lot more detail about the problems with incredibly vague, fuzzy, pointless, and highly open to interpretation rules when it comes to firearm parts and things. Now, I should point out that the ATF has a long history of having kind of fuzzy interpretations on stuff. It isn't something that just happened during the Biden administration. There have been, over the years, a lot of questions about what is a suppressor and how quiet does a suppressor need to be. And if you get a suppressor that has rubber wipes inside, those don't last very long. Is that a replaceable part, or is this a part of a deadly controlled item that's going to require massive paperwork just to get a few extra little discs of rubber to put in there? The ATF has not made a hard ruling, and in fact they've actually decided different things at different times. They've had a lot of different questions about things that should be really easy to measure, like barrel length, but over time they have gotten fuzzier. They have gotten, I would say, more open to interpretation, and they've wanted to give themselves more and more leeway as they've ruled on different things. And right before they redefined frames and receivers, they wanted to redefine pistol braces. Now, right here on the table, I have a short-barreled rifle. But once I take this stock off and I put this shoulder brace on, I will be in possession of an AR-15 pistol. And if I have a couple of different stocks lying on the table, it's really easy for me to accidentally commit a felony with the mandatory minimum sentencing requirement of about 10 years. And it's very difficult to tell the difference between these things. So the ATF very helpfully came up with a multi-factor test that takes into account so many variables that it's actually impossible for me to know what I am allowed to do with this weapon right here. Now, fortunately for me, and I'm also saying this for YouTube's benefit, this is a short-barreled rifle that is completely in compliance with the law because T-Rex Arms is an FFL and we have all the paperwork right here. But if there were some question as to whether or not we should put a different brace on that pistol or a different stock on that pistol, or vice versa because I just messed them up possibly by accident or on purpose for the purpose of the video, who knows what might happen. And the ATF's restriction on pistol braces, which for years have been legal and affirmed by the ATF as not a stock, their change to a new multi-factor test that makes it impossible for me to know which guns in the armory I am allowed to put this on is going to get a lot of people in trouble. Now, the good news is that the lawsuit that took place over this particular pistol brace rule has gone really well, and we're now free from that level of instant accidental felony. But there's a bunch of areas where there still is this fuzziness, and the frame and receiver rule is one of them. I get that it's very hard to define some of these things, but again, firearms are really definable objects. I'm opposed to the government restricting the mere possession of objects, but if it's going to do that, it does have the ability to define objects pretty well. These are objects made out of really simple materials. And all of the metrics of this thing's dimensions are really easily measured. So building out legislation that is so vague and so open to interpretation, probably more than just a mere mistake. Now I understand that it's hard to write legal code sometimes. Legal code is a little bit like computer code. It needs to be interpreted a certain way for a certain set of outcomes to come out of it. And there always needs to be a level of human interpretation that is available for law enforcement and judges to discern intent. A good example of this would be speed limits. If you have a road in your town and the speed limit is clearly marked and the guys enforcing the speed limit have radar guns that are calibrated, you can know for certain whether that person is going faster than the posted speed. And then the police officer has the discernment, the human judgment to decide whether this person is breaking the law because they're being reckless and dangerous, or it's a guy taking his wife to the hospital. That's where that human interpretation is supposed to come in. The ATF is writing laws that are more like, you're not allowed to go too fast on this road, but there are no signs and there are no instruments to determine whether or not you are going too fast. It is entirely up to the interpretation of the agent, and there is no way for you, the driver, or the firearm owner to know exactly what it is that you are allowed to do with your own machinery. Now, this doesn't work super well with the firearm industry because the firearm industry, whether it is manufacturing or whether it is innovation, involves stuff that is really measurable. Whether you're making parts for firearms or for heat presses that you're going to use in holster production, you're going to need precision and you're going to need accuracy and you're going to need repeatability. And so you're going to be really, really good at measuring things and building things that are functional and precise and repeatable. And laws that go this way, this fuzzy sort of undefinable way, this very broad and open to all kinds of interpretation is an issue. And it's an issue that really the ATF has had for a long time. For example, they have dinged people for making muzzle brakes that act like suppressors for no reason other than they make the gun too quiet. But there's no definition of how much you affect the noise, how many dB that you affect the sound of the gun before it becomes a suppressor. Straw sales have been illegal for a long time. If you buy guns and sell them to other people, that's fine, unless you do too many, but they've never said what the number is, or you do it too quickly, but they've never said what the time is. And people get their homes raided and get killed by the task forces that raid the homes over these specific issues that are really not specific in the way that they are described. The ATF is also in charge of explosives because it's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And recently they reclassified certain kinds of rocket fuels used by hobbyists as explosives because they burn, and I quote, faster than other materials. But they didn't apply an actual burn rate. So rocket hobbyists don't actually know what it is or isn't that is an explosive or isn't. And these, again, are things that are really measurable and should be really measurable in the rules. Standards are really important. We've talked about that a lot at T-Rex, but from a legal perspective, it's really vital that gun owners and gun manufacturers know whether or not they are breaking the rules and whether or not they're going to be held to a standard. There cannot be this chilling effect where companies that the ATF doesn't like get punished and you never know where exactly the hammer is going to fall next. Standards are vital in this industry just for basic manufacturing. We have standards for these heat presses so we know whether or not we've wired them correctly, whether or not they operate correctly, and whether or not they make better products for you than the ones that we're making on the old equipment. That's the only way whether we know that we're actually accomplishing our goal. And the ATF needs to be held to standards as well. When they have this very broad mandate, when they have taken control over interpretation of the rules away from Congress and they start making their own laws, their own punishments, their own crimes, and then they apply those very selectively and interpret them very broadly, there is no real way of what is going to happen next, and there's no way to hold them to account. And Again, it should be noted the ATF has a pretty bad track record in this particular area. In the 70s and 80s, they were caught very selectively applying the law and confiscating weapons from people that had expensive weapons collections valued up here rather than the ones being used to commit crimes on the street down here. They were reprimanded for that by Congress. But I don't think they really listened, because in the 90s, they did basically the same thing, very selectively applying certain laws against people that they wanted to go after, who lived in Idaho on Ruby Ridge or in Texas in Waco. And then in 2000, they very selectively ignored applying the law to certain people that they knew for certain were trafficking guns to Mexican cartels because, reasons. So this ability that they have to ignore rules and standards and then hold people to non-rules and non-standards selectively as they see fit is a threat to liberty and freedom and even just the entire justice system. So that's why this particular case is so important. It could be that you're not a firearms manufacturer. You may not even be a firearms owner. If you are, maybe you never planned on building your own gun at home or even buying an 80% lower kit, but it still matters and is important to you because it's important that our legal code be readable and predictable and repeatable. And it is important that our regulative agencies have standards so that people can understand what is and is not lawful. And we have a constitution that creates limitations around what the different government offices can do. So this particular case is going to matter, and I'm glad that the Supreme Court is hearing it in October, but I also am really happy and impressed that so many different Second Amendment groups, legal foundations, and even companies have gotten involved filing briefs and extra information and research so that they have more understanding of the issue. So pay close attention because it's going to be interesting. To be perfectly honest, I'm not clear on whether or not I'm allowed to put these two parts together on YouTube, because YouTube has fuzzy, undefined, and easily reinterpretable rules as well. But thanks to everybody who worked on the Mock versus Garland case, I am allowed to do this in real life. Now, speaking of fuzzy laws and also the enforcement of those laws and raids by federal agencies, I want to tell you guys about a conversation that I had last week with a friend of mine named Paul Vaughn. Now, we had this conversation on the VanDerStok podcast, which we've been doing for years and years on other podcast platforms. But we have moved that podcast to YouTube. So there'll be a link somewhere on the screen that will take you to that video on the new VanDerStok podcast channel. You'll be able to listen to the whole back catalog and weekly interviews and conversations with people or explorations of other ideas related to this stuff. So check it out.